Our speaker today is Neil Helm. Now, many people consider hard science and metaphysical spirituality to be incompatible. Neil is not one of those people. He's a near-death experiencer and serves on the board of Virginia Beach chapter of the International Association for Near-Death Studies. He also served as scholar in residence at EduCase's ARE, where he conducted research and assisted faculty and students with their research projects. But he's also an expert in the field of satellites and satellite communications. He's been Deputy Director of the Institute for Applied Space Research and a Senior Research Scientist in the Department of Electrical and Computer Engineering at George Washington University. He was President of Helm Communications, a DC consulting firm in satellite communications. He's a member of the International Academy of Astronautics, a senior member of the Institute of Electrical and Electronics Engineers, and has served as chair of its Aerospace Policy Committee. He's Associate Fellow with the American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics, and has served as chair of its Communications Satellite Standards Committee. He served as editorial board of Space Communications, an international journal. And he's served as an expert witness at congressional hearings. And he hasn't stopped yet. He recently completed a PhD program in transpersonal psychology at Sophia University. But most of all, he's just a great guy who has helped countless people, countless times, in countless ways. So please welcome Dr. Neil Helm.
Thank you, Lloyd. Gee, it sounds like I've been able to do some things. I've been blessed. And thank you all. My goodness, it's so nice to be back here. It's so wonderful to be back. When Bruce called and asked me, he called so kindly and asked me to speak again, we've been lying low since this COVID thing. I was so pleased to come back and see you all again. And thank you, Bruce, and thank you, Susan, for those inspirational readings. I could just about stop here and we could just all go back and read those readings. And I note that in Paul Solomon's readings, he said, I don't want to condemn the change that's taking place. And neither do I today. It may sound like it, but I think I will use the word lament, how change can be used for greed and for power, but also can be, as Oprah says, and some of the other inspirational readings, can be used for really good. And also, if we are going to evolve, as I believe we are, continuing to evolve and get closer to God, I think that is a part of our change. When Bruce called me, it's interesting. I was reading an article in New Science on quantum mechanics, and part of that particular article said, change is just coming so hard to the science community. The Newtonian physics people just simply don't want to admit that these little quirks and these little muons and these little neons and all these things don't act the way that Newton said they should, and that our science is going to have to change. And it's not going to be easy. The science community, and it got me thinking, and I thought, well, I would speak today on quantum mechanics, but I've sort of talked to you about that before. And I thought, well, let me do something different, and I'll talk about change itself and the goodness and badness of change. So I looked up the word. It's very interesting that it is the act of making or becoming something different. The act of making or becoming something different. And I think making, that probably goes over pretty well. I think we need to make newer things, not that necessarily all things are old and need to be thrown away, but we need to make new things. But becoming, that may be the rub. We may not want to become different. We may like living in our own little world, our own little level of consciousness. And we may think that all this change is not good. And certainly, as I started off with, there's a lot of this making and becoming, the making especially of change can be, as I said, good and bad. I'll look at it in different perspectives. For example, and I'm going to lament a little bit today. It's getting close to voting time, and one of the things, by the way, we all can do is to influence others and to change their attitudes, as Oprah says. And while I don't expect all of you to agree with me, here's sort of my take on it, that one of the most important things that we can do to create change is to vote for the people that we want to be in powers of positions of making new laws and regulations, and so that if we want these people to do the things that we want them to do, to act and behave and to write laws and regulations that we want, we've got to vote for them. And if we don't like many of the laws and regulations that are taking place now, I can't just lament about it. I've got to do something about it. We've got to do something about it. So be sure and get out there and vote in less than 2 weeks now. And know that this making of change is something that can be used to just greed and power. It's just that simple. We've got some good laws. I like, and by the way, it's not all bad news today. There's some really good things. I like the fact that the state of Virginia the governor of the state of Virginia can only be in power for one term. And we need that term limit, I believe, it's my take, on all major politicians. If we can only, what I see, what I see is our Congress, and I've gone to school with, and I know a number of our congressmen and senators. They're getting older, they're getting old white men, and they're stuck in their way, and they're not going to change unless we create that change. And one of the best ways of doing it is to make a term that they can only be one or perhaps two terms in office, and then they're out. And we need new blood and new, fresh, younger, I believe, people. And by the way, again, it's not all bad news. Some good news that I saw in the newspaper is that the Parliament of New Zealand, for the first time, is majority women. So, so there's some good news in this world. There's some very good change taking place. But we have to lament this, and then the change that's for goodness sakes, for a bunch of old white men, and I'm one of them. I don't have any white hair much anymore, but but I've sat in the rooms of power, and I look around and I see, us, a bunch of us old white men, and we make the rules, and we've gotten to be in this room of power because we make the rules, and we sit around and we flatulate, and we think we're very important. And everything that has gotten us into power, we can do that. And then somebody comes along and says, well, what about some new things, some new people coming? Oh, no. The doctors and the lawyers and all of us, we're parts of the associations, and the associations, of course, are good and all that, but we don't want anything new, for goodness sakes, We're wealthy and we're powerful and we make the rules, and that's the way we want to keep it. So some of this change is within ourselves, and I'm guilty of it as others. And so our institutions have got to be influenced by all of us in what we want to do, and that, in addition to the monetary and the thing of businesses and corporations like us to think that change is always good in their direction. And so they make rules, by the way. Something gets old perhaps even before it should be old, but throw it away and buy something new. And always buy something new, because the old, it's too old. And so we're filling our landfills with a lot of good stuff. I was born and reared and raised in a farming and ranch community, and we farmed and ranched. And boy, in the winters we sharpened tools and straightened nails, and perhaps we could, but we didn't want to afford a lot of new stuff. And I grew up that way. So all these new changing rules are hard for me. Of throwing stuff out before the time comes, but they make rules that, this software is not going to be supported, and it could be working very fine, but you've got to buy a new variety, and on the other hand, then there's good. We bought a new car recently, and it's got all these safety features on it, which are good. I mean, if a car comes up by us, a little light lights up on the mirror, and so there's good in change. We have to utilize the good in it and know that it's going to come, but we have to understand that some people use it for power and for greed, and others use it to make our lives better and more sustainable and healthier and more loving. And we have the ability to influence that. We have the ability to do that. And so I can go through historically. It's interesting that a lot of people have, like the arts, they're losing the understanding of history. You read that we're in our 12th to 13th civilization, and every civilization has acted exactly the same way. Every one. We've all came into being. We've all went through stages of gestation. We've all gone through the wonderful growth periods where growth and technologies, all of these civilizations have had them. And then we've gone into a golden age, and then we've gone into a stage of decline. And you go through the past civilizations, and you can see these stages. You can see where the technology is beginning to get old, and where greed sort of takes over instead of allowing the newer technologies to come in and replace the good things. That greed and power comes in, and more influences, and the people in power become more and more greedy, and the civilization goes into a stage of decline. It's happened in every one of them. And we can see it, and we can measure it. And right now, roughly, it's getting closer to 90% of all of the goods and services, all of the land and properties, nearly 90% are owned by 10% of the people. And you may say, well, I own my house, but then you really look at, do you really own most of it, or does the mortgage company? I own my car. Do you really own it, or does the mortgage company or some company? And if we really look at that top 10%, and then we look at how many people are still in poverty, how many children are still hungry, that has to change. And so then we look at every past civilization, and we see that when that number gets above 90 and perhaps close to 95%, and we've gone, by the way, from 80 to 90% in our generation in the last few years. When that figure gets 95%, it's usual decline of the civilization, and it's some number of perhaps generations before the civilization is overrun by basically people who can throw stones. The new civilization comes along, every one of them, with people who could throw the stone the furthest. And we see this, we read it, we understand it, and yet we don't do a lot about it. Or some of us do more than others, and so we have to understand and know that again. And so then we say, well, how do we influence this change for the good? Well, what we're doing right here today is certainly near the top of the list. We're getting together as a loving community of right-minded people, I believe. We're sharing our love, we're sharing our mutual admiration, we're being open to God's love. And I think a lot of us in this change have made some good change. I think most of us, or at least I can talk about myself, I was reared and I was a good Lutheran, and I became a lay pastor. And there's where I found I had to lose my Lutheran dogma. I could not impose that on everyone else that felt they were Christian or Muslim even at that point. Or any other religion. I had to lose that dogma. I had to go back to the simple truths of God and his son Jesus. Like it's the red letters in the Bible, if you ever had one of those old Bibles, which Jesus' own words were in red, and there's only hundreds of them, by the way. Most of us know that. And so you go back and you see what his words were. And he talks about a loving Father, a loving God, a forgiving God. And we know that that's what's important. And that we forgive each other and that we love each other. And the dogma of it, and this group is one of the reasons why my wife and I come and love this community, is that you've been able to work through the dogma pretty well. And we still come together and do all the pretty much right things, but we don't have to get involved in all the creeds and all the thises and the thatses, because that's not what is important. What's important is that there is a loving Father. My take on it, and again, you don't have to necessarily agree with all of that, but my take on it is that we're all on the path. We're all on a path. And the path is to get closer to God. And we're all on that path. And by the way, the other change that I think in getting rid of the dogma is reincarnation. And we have some experts in this group on reincarnation. I certainly don't make this up. But in my readings, I did read where Constantine in the Second Council of Constantinople wrote reincarnation out of the Bible. I mean, he wrote out women, by the way, other things that they write. And I'm sorry if I step on toes that some of you think that the Bible is absolutely the totally inspired word of God. I'm sorry, it's been written and rewritten many, many times. And these councils of Nicaea and Constantinople and these many councils. And Constantinople, they rewrote a lot of the Bible. And we had Justinian, where we had before him early Christian writers who had written reincarnation into the Bible. The church at that time, and you say, well, why did they write it out? Well, you can't sell indulgences if you know that there's a cycle of life and death that is so beautiful and so wonderful, and it works. And we go through these cycles of death, and you go back through every past civilization again. Everyone understood the cycle of birth and death. I go to the first Veda, the first written words in India, in Sanskrit. And the first Vedas, the first written words, talk about going to the gods and leaving some behind, and some are passing and then coming and finding us again. And you read these first written words of how this reincarnation happens again and again. And as we go along this path, we get each reincarnation helps us get closer to God. And that's our goal. That's what it's all about. And sometimes, like change, sometimes we do make a step backwards. Edgar Cayce talks about the reincarnation where he was a riverboat gambler and a womanizer. And he admits he took a couple steps back on the path. And that happens. But most of the reincarnations are positive. We come back, we get on the path, and we want to be closer to God. We want to do that. We want to emulate his truths, and we want to the simple truths, and going back to Jesus' words in the Sermon on the Mount in the Garden of Gethsemane, the Beatitudes and the love and what we should do with that love, and love your brother as yourself. And this, by the way, here is the rub on that, as yourself. If you dislike yourself and you're not happy with yourself, it's going to be real hard to love other people, because you can't get past the love of yourself to get there. You've got to love others like yourself. And so you've got to build that love within yourself and honor and trust and knowing of your own self and how beautiful you are. Each of us is a sacred child of God. That, by the way, the soul, the spirit, is of God in you. And this I'm going to lament again, this whole thing of abortion, and to think of, again, a body of white men telling women what they should do with their bodies. I find it so hard to believe that there's so many people out there who believe that this is the thing to do. And so you look at what's important here. So what we have to look at is when that spirit, that soul, enters the flesh. That's the question. The flesh is the flesh. The ashes are ashes. It's the soul of God that is sacred, that is within us. And abortion is not going to change that. The abortion doesn't kill the soul, doesn't kill God. The concept of that, that's above the soul, and God is above the body, the flesh. So we look at these. We look at these simple truths of change, and we have the ability to influence it. And we know, basically, most of us in our hearts, what is good. And we're here, I think, today because we recognize the truths of our soul and of our spirit and of our God. And that's where it is. Thank you.